Welcome, friends, to Swamp Horror Stories. I've been hearing a lot lately about Arkansas swamp creatures, the Fouke Bigfoot. You know, the one they made a couple movies and docu-series about. One movie in particular comes to mind. It was named The Legend of Boggy Creek. A lot of the filming was done right here in Louisiana, around the Lake Dotrieve area, about the time they still had a dance hall on the wharf overlooking the lake. Some of the older folks will remember that place. If you remember it, please leave me a comment. And while you're at it, go ahead and hit that subscribe and like and hit that thumbs up. So as I was saying, my curiosity was up. So I thought I would head out to Fouke, Arkansas and see for myself what the folks were talking about. And this is where the story begins. There are places down south where woods feel wrong. Not because they're dark, not because they're isolated, but because the forest itself seems to be watching you. I spent more than 20 years living with my wife in the Louisiana swamps. Out there, I learned that not every sound has an explanation. There were nights when I heard things that never showed themselves, and mornings when I'd find tracks that didn't belong to any animal I recognized. Those experiences taught me one thing above all else: never underestimate the swamps. So when I heard people talking about the legendary Fouke Bigfoot in southern Arkansas, I didn't laugh the way most folks did. I listened. Everyone had a story. One old gas station owner leaned across the counter and said quietly, "People come here looking for a monster. Smart ones leave before they find it." I kind of laughed at it. "I've heard that before," I said. He looked at me hard with those dark blue eyes. "Haven't heard it from me." I just kind of shook my head and gathered what I had purchased and walked out the door. Got back on the road, and the road wound through endless pines forests, broken only by creeks, old logging roads and abandoned hunting camps that looked as though no one had visited them in years. Even with the windows rolled up, I could smell the pine sap warming in the afternoon heat. Beautiful country, peaceful. At least that was my first impression of it. I planned to spend 3 nights filming for my YouTube channel. I wasn't trying to prove Bigfoot existed. If all I captured was beautiful woods and a good story, I'd still call it a successful trip. So I parked near an old logging trail where several sightings had supposedly occurred over the past years. The trail disappeared into towering pines that seemed to stretch on forever. Before I grabbed my gear, I stood beside the truck for a moment and just breathed in the cool forest air. The woods were alive. Woodpeckers hammered somewhere in the distance. Cicadas screamed from the trees. A light breeze whispered through the needles overhead. Everything felt normal. About a mile into the forest, I found an abandoned hunting camp. Only part of the roof remained. The windows had long since been broken out and only the holes remained. Someone had sprayed painted warnings across one wall. Simply said, "Leave before dark." Another one said, "He knows." Who he was, I haven't a clue. I assumed it was just teenagers that was trying to scare people off. Still, something about those words stayed with me. As evening settled over the forest, I set my camera overlooking a narrow game trail. Plan was simple. Record until morning. Let the camera ride it out. Maybe capture a deer, coyotes, maybe some wild hogs. They were plentiful around Fouke, Arkansas. Anything would make interesting footage. I finished just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the pines. That's when everything changed. Not gradually, it was instant. Every insect stopped. Birds vanished into silence. Even the wind seemed to disappear. The forest had become still. I've experienced silence before in the swamps of Louisiana. This wasn't silence. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. A loud crack echoed somewhere behind me. It wasn't a twig. It was more like a thick tree limb being snapped. I turned quickly. There was nothing there. It was a little too dark to see, and the flashlight only reached a few dark pine trunks. I waited. 30 seconds. A minute went by. Then I heard it. A single knock. It was clear. It was solid. It was wood against wood. It echoed through the trees. Several seconds later, another one answered from much further away. Tock. Then another, even further away. It sounded less like random noises and more like communication. I kept walking, telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. It's probably hunters or some campers. Could even be someone cutting firewood. But deep down inside, I didn't believe that. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. You know that sensation when someone is staring at you from across a room? Imagine feeling that from every direction. About an hour later, I found tracks, fresh tracks, pressed deeply into the soft mud beside a creek crossing. They weren't bear tracks. They weren't human footprints. Each measured close to 14 inches long, had 5 toes. You could see a distinct heel. The depth suggested incredible weight. I photographed them from every angle, placed my boot beside one for comparison. My size 10 boot barely reached halfway across. Something enormous had crossed that creek only hours before. The sun had completely disappeared. I decided to head back toward camp. That's when the smell hit me. It was like rotting vegetation, a wet dog, something sour, something dead. The odor came in waves, strong enough to make my eyes water. The wind hadn't changed direction. The smell had moved closer. I switched off my flashlight. Sometimes your ears tell more than your eyes. That's when I heard breathing. Slow, deep, heavy, from somewhere ahead. Then a second set from behind me. My heartbeat pounded so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I turned the flashlight back on. Couldn't see anything except empty trees, empty shadows. But I knew, I absolutely knew, I was no longer alone in those woods. I began walking faster, then faster. The breathing kept pace with me somewhere in the trees. It wasn't rushing. It never closed the distance. It just stayed right there beside me. Like something was curious. It was studying me. It was waiting. I finally reached a clearing where I left my camera. The camera was gone. The tripod was still stood exactly where I left it, but the camera itself was nowhere to be found. There was no signs of any animals around. It had simply disappeared. That's when I heard the first howl. It was like a wolf, but not. It was deeper, longer. It rolled through the forest like distant thunder. Before the sound had completely faded, another one answered from somewhere further away. And then another, and then another. Each one drawing closer, and I knew there was more than one. If it was a Bigfoot, there was a family of them. The woods around me suddenly felt very, very small. I grabbed the tripod, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and started toward the truck as quickly as I could without running. Because every instinct I had told me one thing. If whatever was out there wanted me, running would only convince it that I was prey. And somewhere behind me, something huge took a single step. Then another step. Then another. It wasn't trying to catch me, not yet. It was letting me know it had decided to follow. I don't know exactly when fear turned into certainty. At first, I kept telling myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe another hunter was in the woods. Maybe it was a black bear wandering through the area. Maybe my imagination was getting the better of me. But deep down, I already knew something was following me. It wasn't stalking me to attack. It was studying me, testing me. Every 50 or 60 yards, I'd stop walking and listen. When I stopped, a second later, the footsteps stopped. When I started again, they would start. Heavy footsteps echoed through the pine needles behind me. Whatever it was, it knew exactly how close to stay. Close enough for me to hear it. Far enough that I could never see it. I swept my flashlight beam across the trees till my arm grew tired. But I saw nothing. Just endless rows of dark pine trunks disappearing into blackness. I finally reached a clearing where I'd parked my truck. Relief washed over me till my flashlight landed on the driver's side door. I saw 4 long scratches from window nearly to the bottom of the door. They weren't random. They were almost perfectly parallel. Each groove had cut through the paint and into the metal beneath. I passed my fingers across them very carefully. Bear hadn't done this. Not without leaving dents or bite marks or... This looked deliberate, like someone dragged enormous fingernails across the truck, just to let me know they could. I climbed inside and locked every door and started the engine. The headlights flooded the clearing. I didn't see anything except trees. No movement, no glowing eyes, no giant figure standing among the trees. For a few moments, I almost laughed. Maybe I had worked myself up over nothing. Maybe exhaustion was making me imagine things. Then something struck the back of the truck. The entire vehicle lurched forward. It felt as though a grown bull had slammed into the tailgate. I looked in the rearview mirror, but I could see nothing but darkness. I threw the truck into drive and I eased along the logging road. I wasn't about to step back outside. About a mile later, I reached an old bridge crossing a narrow creek. Something made me stop. Maybe it was the smell. That same overpowering odor drifted through the open vents. Rotting vegetation, wet animal, old decay. It was stronger than before. I slowly reached over and rolled up the windows, but the smell remained. My stomach tightened. I eased my foot onto the accelerator, and the truck barely moved. Then all of a sudden, it felt like something let go. The truck surged forward. I didn't stop again. I reached a small campground just before midnight. A few campers were still awake around a fire. The sight of other people calmed my nerves. An older man looked at my scratched truck and frowned. "You been down Miller Road, huh?" I nodded. His expression changed. "You should leave. You shouldn't stay here." "Why?" I asked. He stared into the darkness beyond the firelight. "'Cause whatever marked your truck knows your scent." Nobody around the fire laughed. Nobody had anything to say to him. One younger camper quietly stood up and began loading his gear into his pickup without saying a single word. Against my better judgment, I moved off away from the rest of the campers and decided I would hang around for a while. Curiosity has a way of overpowering common sense. I knew I should have gone, but I had to stay. I had to find out for myself. I parked near the edge of the campground and mounted a second camera facing the tree line. If something came close during the night, I'd finally have proof. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to silence. Fire had burned down the glowing coals. Even the large frogs had stopped calling. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the campground. Seemed like several large biped animals were walking around just in the darkness. Every few moments they stopped. Then they would start again. It felt coordinated, as though whatever or whoever was out there was surrounding the entire campground. A child cried from one of the nearby tents. His father whispered for him to stay quiet. No one shined a flashlight. No one stepped outside. It was as if everyone already understood the rules. Don't acknowledge what's in the woods. The footsteps came closer. I heard something breathing only yards beyond the trees. Deep, powerful. Something much larger even than a bear. Then I heard a low whistle drift through the darkness. A few seconds later, another whistle answered from further away. The footsteps immediately stopped. Every one of them. Silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. Unable to resist, I slowly unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside. The moonlight barely reached the tree line. At first I couldn't see anything. Then as my eyes adjusted, I saw 2 amber eyes open about 7 feet above the ground. Then another pair of eyes appeared from just a little further away to the left. Then another. They weren't glowing like lights. They reflected the moonlight just enough to reveal where they were, watching, perfectly still. One enormous shape stepped partly into the clearing. It had broad shoulders. It had long arms. It had dark hair that blended into the shadows. It wasn't charging. It wasn't trying to attack. It wasn't threatening anyone. It simply stood there, studying every movement. For several seconds, we stared at one another. Then it slowly raised one arm, not in a wave. It was almost as if it were pointing toward the deeper forest. Might have been an invitation, might have been a warning. With that, the creature turned without making a sound and disappeared into the pines. The other eyes vanished one by one. Within moments, the night sounds returned. Crickets, tree frogs, the wind blowing through the trees, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better, because when dawn arrived and everyone began packing to leave, we found enormous footprints circling every tent in the campground. Not one tent had been touched. It was almost as though the creature had spent the night counting us, deciding which of us belonged there and which ones didn't. Couldn't shake the feeling that they had already made that decision, and somehow I was the one they had chosen. The sun should have made me feel safer, but it didn't. Morning light filtered through the towering pines, but the woods still felt unnaturally quiet. Everyone at the campground packed in a hurry. Nobody lingered to drink coffee or swap fishing stories. An older camper caught me loading my camera equipment. "You planning on going back out there?" he asked. "I came for footage," I replied. "So far I don't have anything. I'm not leaving empty-handed." He looked toward the tree line before answering. "Well, just remember this. If something starts throwing rocks, don't throw one back." Before I could ask what he meant, he climbed into his truck and hurriedly drove away. Within 10 minutes, I was alone. The campground was empty. I checked the overnight footage from my trail camera. Caught hours of darkness. Wind moving the branches slightly. Then I saw a raccoon wandering through the edge of the frame. But then, at exactly 2:17 a.m., the picture flickered. For 3 seconds, the screen filled with static. When the image returned, something enormous stood at the very edge of the camera's range. Not clear, not good enough where you could have a clear visual picture. Only its shoulders and one arm were visible, and they were also blurry. It wasn't facing the camera, it was facing my tent. The timestamp skipped ahead nearly 4 minutes. Whatever happened during that time, the camera never recorded it. Against every instinct, I decided to return to the logging road. By noon, I found the muddy creek crossing where I'd photographed the giant footprints the day before. Prints were gone. A light rain had washed them away. But something else had appeared. Fresh pine branches had been woven together and laid across the trail in a rough X. Someone or something had placed them there. I stepped around them and continued. About 100 yards later, a small stone landed on the trail 10 feet in front of me. I stopped. The woods were silent. Another pebble struck a tree to my left. Then another bounced harmlessly behind me. None of them were thrown hard enough to injure me. They seemed intended for one purpose, to get my attention. I slowly turned in a circle. "I know you're out there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer came. Only the breeze moving through the pines. I set my camera on a tripod facing the woods and backed away. "If you're real," I muttered, "and you want to be known, here's your chance." For nearly 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then, a loud crack echoed behind me. I spun around. The camera toppled over. Not from the wind. Something had pushed it or knocked it over. I rushed over and picked it up. The lens was still good. The recording was still running. As I replayed the last few seconds, my heart skipped a beat. Just before the camera fell, a dark figure crossed over in front of it. It moved so quickly that it appeared for less than a second. Too tall to be a man, too upright to be a bear, too fast for me to make out any details. I had seen enough. I headed back toward my truck. The further I walked, the more I felt that familiar sensation. Someone or something was matching my pace. Hidden, always hidden. Then came the sound. Crunch. Behind me, I stopped. Footsteps stopped. I started walking again. They started again. But this time they were a little closer. Without warning, a fist-sized rock slammed into a tree 20 yards ahead, exploding bark into the air. Another landed behind me. A third crashed into the brush off to my right. Whoever or whatever was throwing them wasn't trying to hit me. They were driving me, keeping me on the trail, keeping me moving. I didn't wait for another warning. I broke into a run. Branches slapped against my shoulders as I hurried down the logging trail. Heavy footsteps behind me grew louder. They weren't running, they were walking, but somehow they were gaining ground. Every few seconds I caught the sound of brush moving just beyond the trees. Whatever followed me stayed hidden with a remarkable skill. At last I burst into the clearing where my truck waited. I threw my gear into the passenger seat, climbed inside, and locked the doors. As the engine roared to life, I looked toward the tree line one final time. There, standing between two massive pines, was a figure. Stood nearly 8 feet tall, broad shoulders, long arms hanging at its side. Dark, reddish-brown hair stirred gently in the breeze. It made no threatening movements. It simply watched. For several long seconds, neither of us moved. Then I remembered my camera. This was my chance to get the footage I needed. As I swung my camera into motion, it realized what I was doing. As it realized this, it slowly turned and disappeared into the forest. It wasn't panic. It wasn't haste. But with the calm confidence of something that belonged there. I shrugged my shoulders and threw the camera back on the seat. I drove out of Miller's Road without stopping. When I reached the highway, I pulled over to catch my breath. That's when I noticed something lying on the passenger seat, a single pine cone. I was certain the seat had been empty earlier. It wasn't an ordinary pine cone, though. Its scales had been neatly stripped away until only the center remained. It was almost as if something had gnawed on it and left the center. Whether it had fallen from my gear or somehow ended up there another way, I couldn't say. I still have it today. Whenever someone asks if I believe in the Fouke Bigfoot, I don't tell them I found proof. I simply tell them this. There are forests where you're never truly alone. And if you ever find yourself on an old logging road just outside of Fouke, Arkansas, pay attention when the woods go silent. Because sometimes the silence isn't empty. Sometimes it's listening. Well, I hope you enjoyed this story. Join me next week for another story. I'll probably be back in the swamps of Louisiana at that time. So really enjoyed my visit here and glad I could take you guys along for the ride. Until next week, take care and keep your feet dry and stay out of the swamps.